Well, it's really a great honor to be here today, and the temptation to comment on the previous presentations is nearly overwhelming, but I'm going to resist it and instead give you the talk that I wrote for today. Yes. So what I'm going to talk about today is hidden events, and we've already talked about some of the excesses of science. We've talked about some of the excesses of alternative science. But what I'm going to look at today is the ability of science to assimilate new information, especially information that's highly disturbing. So the title of my talk is Battered Kids and Closed Minds. Now, one of the things about anomalies is that when we think about making decisions about anomalies, we need to understand the dynamics of the sociology of information about anomalies, okay? And I've made this actually a fairly serious study. I started a manuscript on this in 1984, and thanks to the encouragement of my local SSE group, I literally pulled this out of the closet, and I've started working on this again. So the talk that you're going to hear here is part of reflection of that manuscript. So I'm going to use the battered child syndrome as an example of a hidden event. Well, what is a hidden event exactly? A hidden event is a widespread set of experiences that are counterintuitive and thus shouldn't happen. So information about them is slight, and this contributes to keeping the event hidden. Now, here are some key dates for the subject that we're going to talk about. Is there anybody in the room who's more knowledgeable about this than I am? If there is, I'd be curious to know, because you can act as a good critic. In 1947, the first paper in a radiology journal was published which discussed the battered child syndrome. But interestingly enough, it was largely a descriptive paper about the pattern of injuries that were seen by this particular physician, John Caffey, without necessarily indicating that the origin of these injuries to children which he saw was due to parents or caretakers. In 1955, there was a JAMA article published that was really excellent, which discussed the possibility that some of the cases of child injury might be due to intentional abuse. Other possibilities that were considered was that parents might create an accident-prone environment and that the injuries might occur in a sort of unavoidable way. In 1961, we'll talk about this in more detail, at the Academy of Pediatrics Symposium in Chicago, the phrase battered child syndrome first entered public consciousness, and we'll talk about how that happened. In 1962, a definitive JAMA article, Journal of the American Medical Association, was published, essentially detailing the kinds of things that one would expect to see in battered child cases. In 1964, TV, Ben Casey, and I had an episode on child abuse. This was very, very important in informing the public, much more important, I think, than the JAMA article was. And finally, in 1974, there was a passage of the Child Abuse Treatment and Prevention Act, and much could be said about that too, but I need to pass on here. Now, basically, hidden events go through what I see as three stages. First of all, there are uncorrelated observations. There are observations that don't seem to join up to form a pattern, and we'll talk about how that happens. Then there is a controversy stage where there is some public discussion of the reality of whatever it is. I certainly believe UFOs are in this stage right now. And number three, the final acceptance or dismissal of whatever the anomaly is. Sometimes the final dismissal may be a temporary thing, as with, for instance, continental drift, and may come back in a different form as continental drift did. But quite often there is, in fact, a final acceptance of whatever the anomaly is. Now, let's talk about the first stage, uncorrelated observations. And in the case of child abuse, for years, physicians would see injuries that children had that were unexplained by the parental histories. Parents would come into hospital with an injured child, and the histories the parents, this is a medical term, the histories the parents gave did not explain the injuries that were seen, And quite often, interestingly enough, the parents didn't seem to be terribly interested in the health of the child. So the physicians were reluctant to believe that parents could inflict injuries like this. And this was a potent bar to finding out about these kinds of things, because if you don't want to find out about it, often you don't. One pediatrician stood up at a meeting and he said, if I thought parents could do this to their children, I would get out of pediatrics immediately. Okay? So this leads then to an interesting principle, and the principle is this. What we are willing to see is shaped by our ability to handle whatever the situation is. And I think this is a very important thing to understand, that what we are willing to bear witness to is often a function of how much power we feel we have to affect whatever the phenomenon is. Now, in the uncorrelated event stage, there's a kind of pluralistic ignorance. So that this is a term, by the way, coined by the social psychologist Floyd Allport. And he described pluralistic ignorance as a situation in which many people have experiences, but each person thinks that his or her experience is unique. And therefore, it's undiscussable since it's not comparable to other people's experiences. I could give you lots of examples from my own researches on this about people who felt that they had seen something nobody else had seen. And were relieved to find that whatever they were seeing was something that actually a lot of other people had seen. Ball lightning is a common example of this. But the basic point is, if people don't discuss what happens to them, the system cannot learn. Now, there is a transition in many cases from uncorrelated observations to the controversy stage. And a controversy stage is typically triggered by somebody seeing a group of observations, a pattern that they can make sense of in some way, and they can give it a name. So this helps then organize their own perceptions, but it also helps organize the perceptions of other people, and by the way, encourages reporting. Because when people publish an account of some sort of event, other people can then jump in and say, oh, I had one of those. And you'll see how this happened with the battered child syndrome. But at the same time, there are other people who feel whatever is described by this class events is somehow impossible, it can't exist, and therefore it doesn't. Now, with the battered child syndrome, a typical case would present with fractures to the long bones or phalanges, sometimes in different stages of healing, subdural hematomas, blood blisters on the brain, and often a lack of relevant history to explain the injuries. Now here's an example from a social worker of essentially creating a controversy by coming forward with providing a name for something which previously had not been seen to be a class of events. When Ms. Elmer was asking a nurse on the infant floor at Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh about a case she had heard about, where a particular child had been injured, brought to the hospital by the parents, and the parents had left the hospital, she went to the infant floor and asked for the cards for the case. The nurse came back with 6 cards. And she says, if I had thought in such terms at all, I would have considered the original case unique. But in a few minutes' revealing talk with the nurse, abuse had become a class of events with ramifications far beyond the infant and family. But others doubted that parents could do this to their kids. And pediatricians who came across these cases, as well as, by the way, radiologists, had difficulty dealing with these things because there was nothing written about it. And this is a quotation from one of the pediatricians I interviewed. He said, I remember one trip down to San Antonio. He said, usually everybody would gather, and then some of the older, experienced pediatricians would sneak up to you at the cocktail hour. And he said, you know, I've seen a number of these cases. There's just nothing written about it. So the fact that there's nothing written about it tends to indicate to you that you shouldn't, in fact, believe in what you're actually seeing. Now, an interesting comparison to this, by the way, was the discovery of the ozone hole. How many of you are familiar with the history of the discovery of the ozone hole? All right, well, for the rest of you, what happened was very interesting. The British had observed the ozone hole for several years before they revealed its existence. And why did they sit on the data? Because the Americans had not seen it. And they knew the Americans had a satellite called the Nimbus 7. And this satellite had a sensing device that would tell you what was going on in the upper atmosphere. Well, the Americans had a glitch in the computer, actually had been programmed in, that ignored outsized values of ozone. So what happened was the Americans reprogrammed their computer and the ozone hole stood out. What had happened is a systematic blind spot had been programmed into the computer. Now, with the battered child syndrome, one physician suggested it might be bone fragility. These were kids who were easily injured, but they stopped being injured when they got to the hospital. So this leads then to the third stage. And the third stage is resolution, when the issue comes together and is finally admitted to be a fact. The person who convinces the world about this, by the way, is the person who connects the dots. Charles Darwin was the person who convinced the world about evolution, and that was because he connected the dots. He wasn't the first person to discover evolution. And in fact, he wasn't even the first person to publish on it. Or actually what happened is when William Wallace wrote into the journal Nature, the publication was held up until Darwin could prepare a paper himself. So he and Wallace both got credit for this thing. For the battered child syndrome, the person who did this was Henry Kempe, a pediatrician and head of pediatrics at the University of Colorado. Kempe had been observing cases of child abuse for years, but found his resident physicians at the University of Colorado didn't want to see it. So the key event for him was creating a system that would allow them to do something about child abuse if people saw it. And the key thing, yes, thank you. The key thing was creating an interdisciplinary team to deal with the child abuse, a team of pediatrician, radiologist, and social worker. In 1961, he was the head of the Academy of Pediatrics. He decided to use his position to broadcast what he thought was going on, and he did this in the grand ballroom of the Palmer House in Chicago. The Palmer House ballroom held 1,000 people. He had an interdisciplinary panel. He invited the press, and the result was stupendous. Basically, the battered child syndrome was put on the social agenda. So the interdisciplinary team then was what enabled him to do something about it, and that was what encouraged him and his fellow pediatricians to go forward and do something about the battered child syndrome. So the ability to see the problem was intimately connected with the ability to do something about it. Now, an interesting question is, why didn't John Caffey, the pediatric radiologist who published the original paper, why wasn't he the person who brought this forward? And the answer was, he was afraid of legal action. He was afraid that pediatric radiology, which he had pioneered and which he was deeply connected with, would be harmed by talking about something as far out as battered children. So he literally sat on the data. As far as his publications were concerned, he did confide in his residents about this. So principle number 3 is an anomaly will seldom be accepted based on physical evidence alone. It has to be connected up to what we already know. And this, by the way, for ball lightning has been the kiss of death, because nobody really knows what ball lightning is, and therefore, since we can't explain it, we can't accept it. All right, so here's my summary. First of all, when you're dealing with a hidden event, reports will be scarce at first. If you say there can't be any reports, often there won't be. 3, if you expect to be the first to know, often you aren't. Experts sometimes say, well, hey, I would be the first person to know about this. Well, often they aren't. 4, if you create channels for reporting, you will get reporting. This is certainly true of the battered child syndrome, which originally seemed to be hundreds of cases and now seems like millions for the United States. If you encourage reporting, there will be more of it. And sometimes there's over-reporting, and many of you have known as you've gone into the hospital with an injured child or something like that, you're going to be questioned about your role in creating the injuries in the child. I had this happen with my mother, who was brought to the hospital one day sick, and they questioned me for a long time. So finally, resolution, the solution of all these things has to do with connecting the dots, to attach causes to effects, to show how this fits into the scheme of knowledge, and so forth. So this is the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
And thank you, Ron, for an excellent presentation on a very serious subject. Do we have any questions? Subject was too serious. Question, yes, sir.
Yes, I've been long interested in this problem of resistance to innovation, not only in the medical field, but in other fields as well. And I'm wondering, Ron, do you know of anybody who's done any studies to show the actual length of time from, we'll say, the discovery of a phenomenon or a disease or an event or something like this to the time of actual acceptance? Because in some cases it's hundreds, even thousands of years, like Democritus and the theories of atoms in the Greek times of Greek, and then it was around 1900
Yes.
when it was actually accepted. So
Let me give you an example. Mosteller, the statistician, has an article on innovation in Mosteller. Has an article on innovation in Science, okay, the Science journal. And he talks about the discovery of lime juice and its effectiveness in the British Navy. And as I recall, basically the lag between the first discovery of the importance of lime juice and its systematic use is about 100 years. Okay, I'll be happy to give you some other references for similar things in medicine and so forth. Sociologists of technology and medicine have had for a long time lists of things that were resisted by scientists and so forth in spite of discoveries. And basically everybody with a new discovery has to fight a battle of some length to get whatever their discovery is accepted. Science seldom welcomes with open arms people who come forward with things that are non-standard. Could you stand up? Yeah.
I was going to ask a question.
Well, Helicobacter pylori and gastric ulcers is classic. It took 10 years for physicians to start treating ulcer disease, duodenal ulcer disease with antibiotics, even though it was proven that it was caused by a bacteria. And for about 5 to 10 years, doctors would, reluctantly give the bacteria because it was standard, or give an antibiotic because it was standard of care. But they would also give the antacids and tell people to avoid coffee. But it took 10 years.
You've given us a very good microcosmic look at what is a more macro, what I believe is a more macrocosmic problem. And I'm sure everyone here can find their own research in your little principles and such. And I think this is very applicable to the evolution of science as a whole. In fact, your last step could be, if it's a big enough connecting the dots, it could be a scientific revolution. Have you personally tried to put it into these larger perspectives, scientific evolution and revolution?
Well, the fact is that I disagree with Henry slightly that he thinks science has gotten worse. I think it's been pretty bad all along when it comes to this kind of stuff. Okay, I think I've done essentially a comparative study of these hidden events, including the meteorite case, battered children, black-footed ferret, UFOs, sea serpents, ball lightning, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are remarkably common patterns. This is not to say that the stuff that's more questionable today will ultimately be proven to be correct, but simply to note, John Alexander has made fun of faint signals, but often these events announce themselves by faint signals. And the key is, what is the device by which we sort out the signals into those that are potentially researchable? There's a very interesting comment on this, by the way, made by Jean-Baptiste Biot, who was a discoverer in many respects of meteorites and did the first report on the fall in 1803 that essentially closed the meteorite situation for science. And he said, in these matters, he said, the uninformed simply believe. The half-savant decides, but the instructed person knows how to do research. And I think that's a good thought for the SSE, is that we have to know how to do research.
I think you've also, at least for me, I think you've shown me that it isn't just me. It's more or less endemic to human nature.
Yes, I think so.
That's why we call this section the sociology of science. So thank you, Ron. Excellent talk.